Man in Maryville, Tennessee, called 911 sometimes back to report someone was chasing him down the highway. As it turned out, it was the sheriff who was chasing him. All started when a deputy noticed the man driving erratically and signaled him to stop. The man pulled over at first and spun his pickup truck around and fled down the highway. Soon 3 patrol cars were in pursuit. That point was when the man dialed 911 and reported he was being chased. The dispatcher advised him to stop, but the man would not. He ultimately struck a mailbox, rammed a police cruiser. He was treated for minor injuries and since has been charged with vehicular assault, drunken driving, felony reckless endangerment, and felony evading arrest. Not to mention an inappropriate use of the 911 system. So the question is, what gets into people? You know? We all ask that question, right? What is it that got into Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart all those years ago that caused them to jeopardize their ministries and their marriages? What is it that causes a man to go on a rampage and murder his former boss and several co-workers before killing himself? Or a young person to go into a high school and kill 2 of his classmates and injure many others? What gets into a young person that causes him or her to experiment with dangerous drugs and go around with the wrong kinds of people? What causes it to think to make a woman make bad choice after bad choice in the kind of man she marries? And what causes a man to abuse his wife and children? How do you explain it? What gets into us? Some like Flip Wilson. Anybody remember Flip Wilson? Yeah. He would say, "Devil made me do it." That devil. You know, it reminds me kind of a short little story about a little girl who got mad at her brother. She pushed him down, called him a name, and spat on him. Father got on to her and said, "Honey, I think the devil made you do that." The little girl responded, "Devil may have made me push him down, call him names, but I thought of the spitting on him part myself." There are all kinds of ways that we can trace aberrations in human behavior. Some are a chemical imbalance in the brain. For example, depression is often treated nowadays with medication. I've been on, myself, antidepressants for many years. And they are a godsend. And I see it as a gift from God. There's even some kinds of aggression that can be controlled chemically. You know, it's easy to demonstrate, actually, that in animals, where changes in behavior are caused by stimulating different parts of the brain. There was a researcher named Jose Delgado. He planted electrodes into the brain of a ferocious bull. He then went into a rink, bullfighting rink, with the bull, and he was all armed only with the red cape and a radio transmitter. He waved his cape and the bull charged, and then just before the bull approached him, he pressed a button on the radio transmitter and the bull actually came to a screeching halt, only a few feet away from him, and then turned around and calmly walked away. You see, by stimulating certain section of the bull's brain, its entire disposition changed. Wouldn't we all like to have a radio transmitter that we could use on our friends, our family, our government? Unfortunately, that has not yet been made available to us. Which brings me to our passage for this morning. Today's lesson from Mark's Gospel is actually one that troubles a lot of theologians. Jesus and his disciples are in Capernaum. Capernaum is a fishing village located on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's not just a village, would be at that time considered a city. About 10,000 people, laid right on a major trade route. When Jesus began his public ministry, he made Capernaum his home base. Now, our story takes place on the Sabbath. Jesus has gone into the synagogue and begun to preach. And the scripture says that people were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. Go figure. Well, while he was teaching, a man enters the synagogue, and Mark tells us that this man was possessed by an unclean spirit. Other translations will say he was possessed by an evil spirit. And the man cried out, "What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Do you come to destroy us? We know who you are, the Holy One of God." Now let me stop right there. What is an unclean spirit? Is this the ancient world's way of dealing with people who have mental illness? Maybe. Certainly it sounds like this man is emotionally troubled. Certainly ancient people believed in unclean spirits and demons in the ancient world. In his commentary on the New Testament, William Barclay points out that in ancient cemeteries, skulls have been found in which a hole has been drilled. The shocking thing is that it's clear from the bone growth surrounding the hole that happened while these folks were still alive. Kind of sounds horrific, especially before before painkillers. Having a hole drilled into your skull. Now the reason for that was they believed that if you drilled a hole in your skull, it would allow the demons to escape your body. I guess I should ask at this point, anybody need me to drill a hole in your skull? Just so you know, I've got one in the office, and I am licensed to use it if you need me to. No, I'm not really. It's silly. Of course, that was just one of the various forms of exorcism, driving out of demons. Some of which, if you've been paying attention, continue to this day. Interestingly, the Lutheran Church, I think, was the first that restricted and then abolished exorcism way back in 1600s. And then not long after, Calvinists, that's the precursor to Presbyterians, renounced the practice as applicable only for Jesus' day. Truth is, we don't put much stock in unclean spirits or demons, though Hollywood has maintained a lively interest, haven't they? I don't know how many of you had the opportunity years and years ago to see The Exorcist. It was huge. I think they've had 3 or 4 sequels, and there's even a TV show today that's called The Exorcist. All of which indicates that it pays handsomely to frighten people, doesn't it? But exorcism has really maintained only a fringe following in our culture today. It's kind of like the graffiti someone saw on a wall once that said, "Forget to pay your exorcist, and you will be repossessed." Forget that, you'll be repossessed. Yeah, I didn't think it was going to go over very well. I'm just possessed. I can't help it. Some people contend that the resurgence of interest in the occult and witchcraft is a sign of our society's hunger for the supernatural. I don't know if that's really true. I think more likely everybody just is looking for a cheap thrill. The truth is we really don't know for certain what the New Testament means when it says and talks about casting out unclean spirits. What we do know is that Jesus took the man seriously. Saw a man in front of him, for whatever reason, needed his help, and quite naturally, he helped him without the use of a drill. There are many people in our society today unfortunately, who are deeply troubled. And some of those people find their way into church, right? Some of these people are in our family. Some are our co-workers. Some may even be you or me. Is there an unclean spirit that's troubling you? You may be sitting out there placidly listening to this message, suffering from a deep depression. Or maybe you know someone who is. Some of the finest people who ever lived have had times in their lives when they were tormented by such demons. There are demons in our lives that control us as harmfully as demons that tormented people in Jesus' day. Some of the demons that run rampant in our lives are things like pride, guilt, envy, an unforgiving spirit. Sometimes these things control us so completely that we feel powerless against them. I think all of us have sometime felt like we just reached the breaking point emotionally, right? There's a story about a monastery in Europe perched high on a cliff several hundred feet in the air. And the only way to get up to the monastery was to be suspended in a basket which was pulled to the top by several monks who pulled and tugged with all their strength. Obviously, the ride up that steep cliff in a basket was pretty terrifying. One tourist got exceedingly nervous about halfway up as he noticed that the rope which he was suspended in, or that was holding this basket was deeply frayed and old. And with a trembling voice, he asked the monk who was riding with him and how often they changed the rope. Monk thought for a moment and then said brusquely, well, whenever it breaks. You know, truthfully, there have been times in my life when emotionally I have been suspended in that basket. All of us come to that moment sometime in our life, though many would prefer not to show it, right? There was a great cartoon in a magazine years ago. It's a drawing of a boy in distress yelling to his dog, Lassie, get help. And in the next frame, you see Lassie laying on a couch in a psychologist's office. Well, aha! There, okay. Lassie got help. And sometimes, truth is, we need to also. What we need to know is that Jesus is there for us in those moments, offering healing, or often leading us to health professionals who can help us. There are other kinds of unclean spirits that work in quieter but maybe equally troubling ways. For example, many of us are controlled by our fears. Fear is a demon that can cripple us. For some, it's the fear of being attacked. For others, it can be as seemingly benign as the fear of being rejected or being laughed at. Some people are haunted by the fear that somehow they don't belong. They don't measure up. Dr. Thomas Harris wrote a very popular book a number of years ago titled, I'm Okay, You're Okay. Anybody read that book? Some of us have, the older folks like me. One of the salient truths in that book is that we all have scripts that are written and are imprinted in our brains. These scripts even have sound to them that could be the sound of a parent or a parental figure, and we hear these sounds in our heads. Some of those scripts are great scripts, but the painful reality is that the loudest scripts that we have to deal with are the I'm not okay scripts. These are scripts that diminish and devalue us. We hear words like, you always screw up. You're never going to amount to anything. If you don't take care of your room, your clothes, your things, you're disorganized. You're a failure. And so we imprint these words on our brains and they stay with us unless we allow Jesus to exorcise those demons by telling us that we belong, that we do measure up, that we are God's children, and we're accepted in His family, in this family. Similar to that, but maybe the deadliest of all these unclean spirits is the spirit that tells us that we are unnoticed and unloved. On December 14th, 2012, just a little over 5 years ago, 20 children and 6 adults were killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School by 20-year-old Adam Lanza, who had earlier killed his mother, Nancy, in their home. As police approached the school, Lanza took his own life. At the time, it was the second deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Police report reveals that Adam possessed a list of 500 of the world's most notorious mass murderers and was trying to rack up the greatest number of kills in history. Could we agree that Adam Lanza was possessed by an unclean spirit? It was an unclean spirit that told him that his life didn't matter, that he was unnoticed and unloved. The only way to rectify that was to rack up a world record. Then people would notice. It's a terrible thing when you are unnoticed and unwanted. Now, of course, Lance's feelings were his way of acting out. We're in the extreme, right? Most people with such feelings are really no harm to anyone, but they still live a miserable life. Of course, who among us has not harbored this feeling at some time in our lives? You know, listening to the tape, I'm nobody notices me, no one appreciates me, no one laughs at my jokes. Is that the unclean spirit that is troubling you? Do you feel unnoticed, unloved? There's one unclean spirit that the gospel should dispel. That's the one. Because you are loved. Jesus said so beautifully, actually, in Luke chapter 12, verse 6, where He said, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are numbered. Do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Jesus was teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum when a man in the grip of an evil spirit began shouting at him. Now, we don't know the nature of the evil spirit, but we know that Jesus delivered that man. We don't know whether that man had a family, but maybe at least in my imagination, I can see him returning home in his right mind with a serene look on his face, and wife gets up, greets him at their door. His children look suspiciously from behind their mother's skirt at him, and he gently calls them out and lifts them into his arms. And he turns to his wife and says, "I'm back. Thanks be to God." See, that's what can be true for each of us. Now, I joked in the beginning that I might perform an exorcism at the end of the service. Unfortunately, I left my drill at home, and so that's not going to happen, because really only Jesus can cast out an unclean spirit. And He does so when we open our hearts to Him by filling us with so much love, so full of the love of God, that there's no room for any other spirit to torture us. Are you afraid? Angry? Feeling unnoticed? Unloved? Open your heart to God and let God create a new heart and a new spirit within you. Amen. Our hymn